Back to Lori on Liberty on 94.9 News Now and Stimulating Talk.
Welcome back to the Lori on Liberty Show with your guest host, Hal Shurtleff. And I want to thank Lori again for the opportunity to fill in for her, to sort of be her backup quarterback. And speaking of quarterbacks, the Patriots are up 28-7. So there's no need to watch them. You know they're going to win it. So just stay listening to this show here because we have a great guest on. He is a former colleague of mine. We both at one point served as field reps for the John Birch Society. He is a constitutional scholar. That means he studies the Constitution. And you can be a scholar too, folks, if you just study it, especially if you get a hold of his Robert Brown's The Constitution is the Solution, which is a, what, Robert, a 6 or is it 8 CD?
6 lecture series, yes.
6 series. And that's actually sitting through 2 football games, right? About the equivalence in time?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, so I mean, if you can sit through 2 football games, you can sit through this, and you can also get a copy of this and show it to your family. You can host people from your church. You can go to the local library and start a constitutional study group. So welcome, Robert Brown, who's calling in all the way from Montana.
Thank you for having me.
And by the way, we did, Camp Constitution brought Robert into the area a couple of years ago. We had him speak in New Hampshire. We had him speak in Maine. We had him in front of legislators on the subject of the Constitution and the Article 5 aspect of the Constitution, more specifically stopping the Article 5 convention. So, Robert, can you talk a little bit about an Article 5 convention, what it is, and why it ain't a good idea?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, just to get a little bit of definition here, the Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution is the section that talks about how to make changes or amendments to the Constitution. There are 2 ways listed. We've only ever used the first one. The first one is Congress proposes an amendment. It passes both houses with a 2/3 majority vote. Then it's sent out to the states, and you need 3/4 of the states to ratify those changes. That's how every amendment that we've ever added to the Constitution has been passed.
And I like to add, too, that our founders made it difficult for a very good reason.
Oh, absolutely. They didn't want regular changes to the Constitution at every passing whim. They wanted it to be a stable document with only changes that were really needful, and the nation was really united behind it. And so then we get to the other type of amendment proposing process, which is the Article 5 convention, where you have 2/3 of the state legislatures apply to Congress for a convention, and Congress calls a convention for proposing amendments, which then also, according to Article 5, would go out to the states for ratification with a 3/4 majority. So that's the basis of what an Article 5 convention is. Interestingly, the very first time it was ever proposed to start using it was just after the Constitution was adopted, when they were saying we need to add a Bill of Rights. Mm-hmm. And there began to be a movement, hey, let's use this new provision, Article 5 Convention, to add that Bill of Rights. And Madison wrote on several occasions warning against that, saying it would be dangerous to pursue an Article 5 Convention. It would be much safer to have Congress propose the amendment. One of the things he pointed to was that the convention would feel much greater freedom or latitude to make massive and sweeping changes to the Constitution, where he felt Congress would be a lot more of a single focus. They want this change, we'll add this change, and so on. So he repeatedly warned against it, finally got that process to go through Congress to add the Bill of Rights.
And a Bill of Rights was passed. Now he wrote Now you mentioned he mentioned this on several occasions, but the one that I'm more familiar with was a letter that he wrote to, I guess it was a neighbor or a colleague, George Tuberville, where he said he would shudder at the thought of a convention, and he thought the climate, and this is just the Constitution that New Hampshire ratified it, was it February, February of 1788, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes.
And then so at that point it became the law of the land, and of course the first Congress wasn't sworn in until the following year in the first president, but it was the operating document, and there were 2 states, was it New York and Virginia, that had applied for a convention.
Yeah, I recall both of those.
Both of these, yeah. So,
fortunately, they didn't pursue it at the time. He was like you were saying in that letter to George Turberville, he felt it caused him to tremble at the thought. And his concluding statement in that sentence was, "In the present temper of America."
And of course,
I'd like to focus on that.
But of course, things have got so much better now. There's such agreement. Exactly. There's nothing but love and charity amongst all peoples in this country, right?
To take his perspective just a little further, 2 months later, he wrote a similar letter. This one was to a man by the name of George Eve, E-V-E. That was in January of 1789. Yeah, 1789. And in that one, he points out, again, warning against a convention, saying Congress would be the safer route. And in this case, he warned against having a convention in the present ferment of parties, which I thought was an interesting perspective to help us understand this present temper of America that he was so concerned about. If there's a time of great political divisiveness, like he was describing then, he felt that was a very dangerous time to be opening the Constitution through a convention.
Okay.
Like you're saying, it's a good thing we have such harmony today.
So let me be the devil's advocate. What did Madison know about the Constitution? He wasn't a scholar. He didn't have a degree from Harvard Law School. What did he know about it, right?
Yeah. And to get a little historical perspective, he's referred to often as the father of the Constitution for good reason. Mm-hmm. He was the main impetus to get the states to come together to form that Constitution in the first place. He, more than anybody, was attentively taking notes throughout the entire convention. At almost every discussion, debate on every provision that was added, you have Madison's notes describing that process. So he really sits at the forefront as the number one scholar of the formation of the Constitution in its original meaning. And
is it safe to say that he wasn't funded by George Soros?
I would say so.
Okay, good. Okay, we're stepping out on a limb here and making that statement. No, we don't think Madison was funded by George Soros. Now, so give us now, since we had two applications, and then from there till about the early 1900s, give us a little historical background about applications that states had passed.
I don't have off the top of my head a great deal of the history back and forth. There have been several times where there began to be a movement for a convention, and then it, in some cases, got fairly close. I think the closest we ever came was right around the 1900 range, when the progressives were pushing for changing the election of our U.S. senators, which they finally got passed through the 17th Amendment through Congress.
Yeah, I believe
the next closest was 1983 with a balanced budget amendment push. We got, I think, around early 1900s, we were within about 1 to 2 states, and in 1983, we were within 2 states of having enough applications for a convention.
And I think
those are the closest times we've ever gotten.
Now, these applications, right now, the balanced budget. Now, of course, a conservative-minded person listening to this show would say, "What in the world? Why in the world would you be against a balanced budget amendment?" And I think there are two ways. Well, first off, the balanced budget amendment will not guarantee a balanced budget. The second thing, because there's escape clauses, but it's the vehicle for that. The vehicle would be an Article 5 convention. And as you point out, under Article 5, states do not have the power to control their job. The state legislators' only job is to apply for one. And they can put down whatever reason they want to, but the reasons in that application really have no legal bearing. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Other than the convention application, that's the only part that really has any validity to it. In fact, there have been numerous court decisions that have declared that the convention does not represent the states. In fact, this comes from a journal known as Corpus Juris Secundum, which is basically a collection of various court decisions from all around the country. It cites 5 different court decisions, starting from the late 1800s into the 1900s and so on. And the conclusion from all of them is this. I'll read it directly. It says, "The members of a constitutional convention are the direct representatives of the people, and as such, they may exercise all sovereign powers that are vested in the people of the state. They derive their powers not from the state legislature, but from the people, and hence their power may not, in any respect, be limited or restrained by the state legislature. Under this view, it is a legislative body of the highest order and may not only frame, but may also enact and promulgate a constitution." That's pretty clear.
Can you repeat that source, and where can listeners get somehow get a hold of that source?
It's a little bit difficult unless you have a law practice to get a hold of this.
I see.
But it's called Corpus Juris Secundum, and this is basically, like I was saying, it's a journal collection of various court decisions from all around the country.
Okay. I know that there's a lot of...
Here's what courts have said on various topics.
So once a legislature votes in favor of a convention, and it has to be passed, it's passed by the states, legislators, they may never even have any say on anything that comes out of that convention. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. One of the things that Article 5 does say regarding ratification, once the convention's done with whatever it comes up with, it then is ratified by either 3/4 of the state legislatures or 3/4 of the state convention, meaning instead of having the state legislatures ratify, they would call for special ratifying conventions in each state, bypassing the state legislature.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like you're saying, and it's up to Congress to decide which of those two they use.
But, of course, there's all kinds of laws and rules guiding an Article 5 convention, so we have nothing to worry about. Is that correct?
Actually, no.
No law? Oh, my goodness. Okay.
Actually, no. No, there isn't. There have been a few times where Congress has proposed a number of, a number of laws and things like that, but nothing has yet been set in stone. But Congress has put themselves forward as the ones that would make those decisions, which is interesting. On 41, 42 occasions, they've introduced various bills for here's how the whole structure is supposed to work. In fact, on 2 occasions, they passed these bills unanimously in the U.S. Senate.
Right.
But then it lost momentum. The whole movement for an Article 5 convention nationwide started to lose steam, so the House never took it up. But in the one that passed last through the Senate unanimously, said things like the states will not be represented on a equal basis, one state, one vote, but rather they would be represented on their electoral college model.
So that's important. That's important to point out because let's look at California. There's over 50 congressional electoral votes, right? There's between 50 or so members of the House and 2 senators. Now we know that that's a Bible Belt area, and there'll be 50 or more hardcore right-wing extremists. Would that be correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. California's always been bastion of liberty.
And, of course, Connecticut and New York are full of right-wing extremists, too. Actually, just the opposite would be the case. You'd have let's look at New York, New England, with the exception maybe of New Hampshire. I know you can't even say that anymore. You can't say it this next 2 years. New York, California. Let's think about some other states.
The next largest one is Texas, which we generally think of as a really conservative state.
That's right.
It's becoming far less so. Many of their congressional districts are swinging to the left now.
It's on the brink. So there's of course, this convention will not be made up of people who share the views of you and I and many listeners. It'll be made up of the establishment Republicans. It'll be made up of the people on the far left, the George Soros camp. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the organizations that are pushing for one, and what progress they've made on that.
Sure. In fact, the one I want to bring up has done us some great favors, actually, a Convention of States, because something they did back in September of 2016, they held a convention simulation to show the world that this is a safe process, this is how it's going to work, and basically just to demonstrate the whole thing so people would not feel like it was such a fearful and unknown thing. And by doing so, first of all, their convention simulation was, by my estimation, a runaway convention.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they didn't realize that at the time. But just a few weeks ago, I had Robert Nadelson, one of their big cheerleaders, on our local radio show here in Montana, talking about here's what the Convention of States application prohibits their delegates from doing. Number one, they can't change the Bill of Rights. Number two, they can't increase federal power. So what he's essentially saying here is, if the convention were to do any of those things, it would be a runaway convention. Now we look at that convention simulation. We had delegates, mostly state legislators, from all 50 states come together in colonial Williamsburg, Virginia, back in September of 2016, and they proposed, after several days of debate and discussion and so on, they proposed 6 amendment proposals. Most of those, from a constitutional scholar standpoint, do expand federal power. For example, one of them refers to, and I'll quote it directly, federal law issued by the Congress, President, or the administrative agency. That's a little bit different than what the Constitution currently says, Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1, all legislative powers in Congress. When you now refer to federal law being made by Congress or the President or the administrative agencies, you just massively expanded federal power, especially of the executive branch.
That's a very interesting point.
He now doesn't need Congress at all. He can just pass any laws he wants to. He's got full constitutional authority 24/7.
That particular amendment, if it were ever to pass, would do away with Article 1, Section 1 that says all lawmaking abilities are vested in Congress.
Precisely. That's a massive increase in federal power. They actually had two different amendments that had that type of language in it.
Yeah, nobody caught it, huh? So
nobody caught it.
Because they weren't.
That's the problem.
They weren't constitutionalists to begin with.
Yeah, exactly. If you're not already familiar with the verbiage and language and what is in the Constitution already, you run the risk of accidentally damaging it. It's like inviting your grocery store clerk to do heart surgery. They're not familiar with the inner workings of the heart and how to do it without killing the patient. They're going to kill the patient.
Well, here's one thing that
constitutional ignorance is going to kill the Constitution if we let them open it up and change it.
This term limit proposal, term limit amendment, whether it be through Congress going 2/3 and then going to the various legislators, or through an Article 5, every proposed amendment that I've seen has an escape clause, and it's two things: declaration of war, or state of national emergency.
Speaking of the balanced budget.
The balanced budget amendment. Yeah, looking in my Constitution, I don't see any reference to a national emergency. So if an amendment like that is passed, you've now made national emergencies constitutional. Would that be correct?
Yes, and not defined.
Not defined.
And so the problem there is anything they say is a national emergency now becomes the out for you don't have to balance the budget.
So a Republican congressman who likes to spend money, but he doesn't want to really answer to his constituents, would say, hey, I supported the amendment. That's the best I can do. I'm sorry that something happened 10,000 miles away and we're in a national emergency. And by the way, I think you would agree, President Trump does not need to call a national emergency to enforce border security.
Oh, absolutely.
I look at Article 4.
That's part of his duty, according to the Constitution.
It's his duty, but then you have Article 4, Section 4, which most people don't. And a lot of conservatives are saying, oh, yeah, we have, if the Democrats can do it, we should do it. Well, no, we're constitutionalists. Article 4, Section 4, as you know, says that the United States can protect states from invasion. They don't have to invoke us now. And I wish, why can't Robert Brown be a Trump advisor? Why can't Hal Shurtleff be a Trump? But even just give me a call, Donald, for 5 minutes. I can set you straight on this one,
Yeah, if he'd listen, it'd be great.
Yeah. So where are we with the, we got 10 minutes left here, give or take. Where are we with states, this convention of states? Then this group called Wolfpack is another one that's, I think they're losing a little bit of steam, thankfully.
Yeah, and there are really four main leading groups that are pushing various things like that. You mentioned two of them, Convention of States, Wolfpack, term limits you've mentioned, and then the Balanced Budget Amendment movement as well are really the main four. There are other ones, but they haven't gained a lot of momentum yet.
And go ahead, I'm sorry.
Currently, the Balanced Budget Amendment one is the one that has the most number of applications currently on the books because they've been going on this for decades. A lot of them have been on the books for 30 or 40 years or more. And so they have, at last count, I think 28 of the needed 34 applications. So they're the closest, but they have kind of hovered around that number for quite a few years now, adding one, losing one, back and forth.
I think there were some states that rescinded recently, Nevada, Maryland. I think there were a few others. And could this be the case? And I think we should act like we're 6 states away regardless. But if don't these applications have to be pretty much consistent in their verbiage, or is that what Congress is saying? Look, or something that's 30 years old may not be valid? Could that be an issue?
There are a lot of questions there. In fact, one of the points, again, going back to that rules bill that was passed by the U.S. Senate, one of the things they put in that was that applications only last 7 years.
7 years.
Which I'm in favor of that, partially because you would want to make sure that, hey, some states from 20, 30 years ago felt it was a good idea to have a convention. Do they still feel so now? You want to have the 34 states that together at the same time feel like, yes, we're in a circumstance we want to have the convention, not a couple then, a couple later,
Or even
spanning over
2
30, 40, 50
generations.
years or more, yeah.
There's one in Vermont that calls for the outlawing of a constitution, an amendment to outlaw bigamy and polygamy, which was done without an amendment. I
right.
mean, yeah, without Article 5 convention.
That application's been around for more than 100 years.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't represent the will of the people today.
And there's also
that's part of why Congress would do that.
There's some that going back to the 1940s and 50s that are calling for a change in the Constitution to make a world government possible. I hope we won't have one of any. That doesn't get passed anytime soon.
Right. But we can't rest on our laurels and say, well, Congress has said that it's only going to be 7-year applications and they expire, because, again, when that comes to that point, will the current Congress still feel the same way? So, yeah, we do need to treat it as we are just 6 states away from this, whether Congress decides to go that route and recognize all 28 or not.
Now,
at this point, we need to make sure we don't get to that 34 in the first place.
I have to. This was an incredible event. There was a legislator in Montana a couple of years ago who sponsored an Article 5 resolution. I think it was the so-called Convention of States resolution. And by the time the hearing date was set, he had changed his mind. And when he testified on behalf of the resolution, he said, I have to withdraw this since I've come up with more facts. I like to think that you and I'm sure others in Montana had a lot to do with that through simply educating him on that subject.
I'd have to ask him directly to know who had the most influence on him, but just 2 days prior to that hearing, he was a guest side-by-side with me on a radio show. The two of us were supposed to be set up to debate his bill. And he shocked me because he gets on the show and tells about his bill and what the purpose of this Convention of States application is. And then I got on and said, the Founding Fathers never said that's what Article 5 is for.
That's right.
They said Article 5 is for correcting errors in the Constitution. When we're trying to rein in the federal government who's blatantly ignoring the Constitution, they said we need to work on constitutional enforcement.
That's right.
Which I sum up as Article 6, where they have their oath of office. They swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. Let's hold them to it. As I explained that on the air, he said, I need to know more about this Article 6 solution. And so the rest of the show, I was bringing him up to speed on the founders' arguments against Article 5 and in favor of Article 6 constitutional enforcement. And then at the beginning of the hearing, 2 days later, just before it began, he pulled me aside and says, nobody here knows I'm going to do this, but just so you know, I'm going to be testifying against my own bill today. And
by the way, Camp Constitution's YouTube channel has that testimony. We have it was an audio. We converted to a video and put it up there. What was the gentleman's name?
Brad, and he says his last name Sheeta, T-S-H-C, or T-S, something like that, T-S-H-I-D-A or something like that.
Right, it has an interesting spelling. Yeah, so if you just put that in. In fact, we have a playlist with lots of videos on the subject, including some that you gave, some of the presentations you gave in New Hampshire and Maine, and some of the radio interviews, and this one will be up there soon as well. There was also a legislator in Maine I'd become friendly with, Sheldon Hannington. He sponsored a resolution on the Convention of States, and he changed his mind, and I interviewed him last winter for a short time, and I said, what changed your mind? He said, I got educated on the subject. He just, heard one side. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like, hey, we don't like this runaway government, and if this is the solution. So what is the solution, Robert Brown? If an Article 5 convention isn't going to save the Republic, what will? What can we do?
This is where I put out my little mantra, Article 6, not 5. Mm-hmm. Because what Article 6 is about is really we the people and we the state have a duty to enforce the Constitution. I'm going to give a list here, and people can play it back and then write it down if they need to, but a list of references to look to in the Federalist Papers where they talk about the power of the state and the power of the people to enforce the Constitution. It starts with Federalist 16 with Alexander Hamilton. We go on to 26, 33, still Hamilton. Then you get into Madison with Federalist 44, 46, 48, and 49. What they're both saying in there is state legislators have the right and the duty to refuse to implement bad laws, unconstitutional laws, to stand by the Constitution even when the federal government does not. But it also talks about we the people have a tremendous power. Federalist 46 in particular is really good about that, where it talks about the power that we the people have to enforce the Constitution through our voice and through our vote with our state legislators and with our federal members of Congress and so on. And so that's what it really comes down to. But in order to be able to do that, and this comes from Federalist 16, it requires a people, quote, enlightened enough to distinguish between an authorized and an unauthorized use of federal power. That's the key. We need to know the Constitution well enough to know when it's being violated, so that we can call our congressman and say, you're following the Constitution well, you're not. I'm going to call you to the table here when you're not following the Constitution. We did that really well with my congressman a few years ago, to the point where he was starting to really follow the Constitution well. Then he had aspirations for a new position. We had to start over on our new congressman. It's a never-ending cycle.
And
we always have to keep our congressmen hearing from us, so they know we want you to follow the Constitution as written.
We have 2 minutes left. Where can right? Oh, by the way, I want to mention that last year there has been not one new application for an Article 5 that was passed, in spite of all the millions of dollars in lobbyist money. But we have a new cycle this year, and if you're listening, or whatever state you may be in, please contact us. We can put you in touch with people locally that are opposing this, and we can get you up to snuff with the information. Robert, you did an incredible 6 DVD series. Where can people get a copy of that?
2 ways. You can get an actual physical copy, which includes the entire course, from jbs.org. You go to their shopping section there, and The Constitution is the Solution 6-lecture DVD series, plus class supplemental material. There's a class lecture manual, so that even if you don't know the Constitution, you can run these courses and have all the answers to all the questions and so on. And then you can also view the videos online free, just on YouTube. Mm-hmm. You don't have the full course access that way. Okay, we have 1 minute left. Robert, I want to thank you. Also, Robert does speaking engagements, and Kemp Constitution also does speaking engagements on this subject. So we're running out of time. Please visit us on our website, campconstitution.net, and also help with the Lori and Liberty Show. Be a listener and a sponsor. And with that, we want to thank you, and God bless. Through the night. Get up, back, but still